Only 9 people were in that room when it happened. 9 people, and not one of them spoke about it publicly for over a decade. Not because they were told to stay quiet, not because anyone threatened them, because what they saw that night in Oakland, California, in the autumn of 1964, defied every law of physical reality they had ever believed in. They were grown men, veterans of combat, men who had spent their entire lives training their bodies into weapons, and every single one of them stood frozen, jaws open, eyes unblinking, staring at a 135-pound man who had just done something no human being was supposed to be able to do. The challenger was already on the floor. It had taken 3 seconds. Let's go back, because this story doesn't start with the fight. It starts with a dare. It starts with a community that felt its secrets were being stolen. It starts with a letter, formal, deliberate, and dripping with hostility, slipped under the door of a gym on Broadway Street in Oakland in the early days of October 1964. Bruce Lee was 23 years old. He had only recently opened his second school, the Junfan Gung Fu Institute, and already the whispers had started. Not whispers of admiration, not whispers of curiosity, but whispers of anger. The old guard of the Chinese martial arts community in San Francisco had heard what Bruce was doing, teaching kung fu to non-Chinese students, openly, without permission, without apology. To the masters of Chinatown, this wasn't just a policy violation, this was war. You have to understand the world Bruce Lee was living in to understand the weight of what happened next. The Chinese martial arts community in 1960s America was sealed tighter than a vault. These were men who had carried their traditions across oceans, who had survived discrimination, poverty, and cultural erasure. The martial arts they practiced, Wing Chun, Hung Gar, Choi Li Fut, were not hobbies, they were identity. They were heritage. They were the last unbroken thread connecting them to the land they had left behind. And here was this 23-year-old, born in San Francisco but raised in Hong Kong, standing in Oakland with a mixed class of white students, black students, Japanese students, and teaching them the sacred movements of their ancestors. The letter that arrived at his gym said it plainly. Stop teaching non-Chinese. Shut your school, or face the consequences. Bruce read the letter twice, set it down on his desk, and then, according to Wong Jack Man's own later account, Bruce Lee smiled. Not a mocking smile, not a nervous smile. The calm, unhurried smile of a man who had already made his decision long before the question was ever asked. His response was immediate, unambiguous. Send your best man. The man they sent was Wong Jack Man. And before you picture the fight, you need to understand who Wong Jack Man was, because this story only becomes legendary when you understand exactly what Bruce Lee was walking into. Wong Jack Man was no amateur, no street brawler with something to prove. He was a formally trained Grand Master of Northern Shaolin Kung Fu, a practitioner of Tai Chi in Xingyi Quan, and by every account from people who trained alongside him, a fighter of extraordinary fluidity and power. He had trained for years under respected masters in Hong Kong before coming to America. His movements were clean, precise, and deceptively dangerous. He was also significantly larger than Bruce Lee, taller, longer reach, more mass. When Wong Jack Man walked into that gym in Oakland on the afternoon of the challenge, he was flanked by witnesses, senior members of the Chinese martial arts community who had come to watch the outcome they fully expected to see. Wong Jack Man would demonstrate that the young upstart had overreached, that the traditions of their forebears were not to be handed to outsiders, that Bruce Lee would submit, close his school, and return to his place. The room that afternoon had the energy of a courtroom before a verdict. Hushed, charged, everyone already certain of the sentence before the judge had spoken. Everyone except one person. Linda Lee, Bruce's wife, was there.
She stood near the back wall, watching. She would later describe the atmosphere as suffocating. The Chinese representatives who had come with Wang Jack-man barely acknowledged her. They spoke in Cantonese amongst themselves, gesturing toward Bruce's students, toward the training equipment on the walls, toward Bruce himself, who stood in the center of the floor, relaxed, in a plain white training top, hands loose at his sides. She watched her husband and felt something she would struggle to name later in interviews. It wasn't fear, it was closer to awe, because she could see what the men across the room couldn't see, or wouldn't. Bruce Lee was completely, totally, eerily calm. Not the calm of someone suppressing nervousness, not the brittle calm of forced composure, the deep, oceanic calm of a man who existed, in that moment, without doubt. She had trained with him. She had watched him move in the small hours of the morning when he thought no one was watching. She had seen what his body could do when the restraints came off. The men across the room thought they were here to witness a lesson. They were right. The rules, if you could call them that, were established quickly and without ceremony. No protective equipment, no rounds, no judges. This wasn't a sport. This was a test of systems, of philosophies made flesh. Bruce's street-sharpened, philosophy-breaking, evolution-driven approach to combat. Bruce had already been questioning the classical styles for years. He found them beautiful, genuinely, deeply beautiful.
He believed they had calcified, that centuries of ritual and repetition had turned living combat into choreography, that the elaborate forms and patterns of traditional kung fu were like pressed flowers, perfect reminders of something that had once been alive. He wasn't disrespectful of tradition. He simply refused to be imprisoned by it. Wang Jack-man bowed. Bruce bowed. The room contracted around them. The 9 witnesses pulled back against the walls. Linda did not look away. And then the fight, if you could call it a fight, began. What happened next has been debated, reconstructed, disputed, and mythologized for 60 years. Here is what Linda Lee witnessed. Here is what Bruce himself described to his closest students in the years that followed. Here is the account that, filtered through multiple independent sources, forms the most complete picture of those 3 minutes in Oakland. Wang Jack-man came in controlled, measured. His hands moved in the classical guard of his style, structured, elevated, designed to protect while channeling force. His footwork was clean. His eyes were steady. He was good. He was very, very good. And Bruce Lee, in the first 40 seconds, could not land a clean hit. Let that breathe for a moment, because this is the part of the story that the mythology often skips, the part that actually makes what happened next so astonishing. Bruce pressed in, rapid, explosive, probing. He fired combinations that blurred at the edges of visibility, straight punches, shifting angles, the chain punching of Wing Chun layered over footwork no classical style had prepared Wang Jack-man for. And Wang Jack-man moved, retreated, circled, covered. His training held, his nerve held. For 40 seconds, 2 elite fighters tested the walls of each other's defenses. The room was silent. Someone later said you could hear people breathing. And then, something shifted. Bruce Lee found it. There is no better word for it than that. He found it. The specific, momentary geometry of distance and angle and timing that exists between 2 fighters in motion. The fraction of a second when the structure of the defense opens like a door. He had been building pressure, varying rhythm, shortening and lengthening the distance between them in patterns designed, consciously or not, to create exactly this. And when the door opened, Bruce Lee did not hesitate. Not for 1/100th of a second. He was already through it. 3 strikes in a sequence that witnesses described, separately, years apart, in different languages, with almost identical language. Faster than I could follow. Not fast like a quick athlete. Fast like a change in the weather. Fast like something that had already happened before you registered it was beginning. Wang Jack-man staggered. His guard, the guard that had held for 40 disciplined seconds, collapsed under an impact that drove not just into his body, but through it.
Bruce Lee's striking philosophy was never surface level. He wasn't hitting the skin. He was hitting the space 6 inches behind the skin. The force transferred internally, rattling the architecture of the body in a way that no amount of conditioning fully prepares you for. Wong Jack Man went down. Not dramatically, not like a man thrown from a building. He simply ceased to hold himself upright. His knees folded. He caught himself on one hand, and for a moment that several witnesses described as the strangest they had ever experienced, the room did not make a single sound. Then Bruce stepped back, and that was it. What happened in the seconds after the fight ended may be more revealing than the fight itself. Bruce Lee walked to the corner of the room. His breathing, this is Linda's account, and she was watching closely, was elevated. He was agitated. Not angry, agitated in the way of a man who has just done something and is already interrogating what it means. He turned to Linda. "That was too slow," he said. She stared at him. The man who had just put a trained master on the floor in under 3 minutes, after only 40 seconds of genuine resistance, was dissatisfied with his own performance. Not performing humility, not calculating the optics of modesty. Genuinely, visibly, turbulently unhappy with what had just occurred. Because Bruce Lee's mind, that engine that never rested, was already running the replay, already finding the moments where hesitation had leaked through, the moments where training had flickered and instinct had lagged behind intention. He had wanted to end it faster, cleaner, with less searching, less adjustment, less cost on his end. He looked at his own hands like they had disappointed him. This was the moment, Linda would say decades later, that she understood her husband completely for the first time, not as a martial artist, as a philosopher. Because what he had just done was not enough for him, not because of pride, not because of ego, but because his standard was not other men. His standard was perfection, and perfection for Bruce Lee was not a destination.
It was a direction, infinite and unreachable, something you ran toward, not something you arrived at. He wasn't celebrating, he was already working. The 9 people in that room dispersed quietly into the afternoon. The delegation from Chinatown left without speaking. Wong Jack Man, to his significant credit, was not broken by what had occurred. He would continue to teach, continue to train, and would later describe his experience that afternoon with a restraint and dignity that earned him considerable respect. He acknowledged Bruce Lee's speed. He did not publicly concede defeat, and this ambiguity would fuel debate for years. But the community had sent its message, and Bruce Lee had sent one back. The school stayed open. The students, Chinese, Japanese, black, white, kept coming. The letters stopped. And in the weeks that followed, something shifted in Bruce Lee himself. The fight had confirmed something he had been circling for years. The classical styles, his own included, were too rigid, too codified, too much ceremony wrapped around too little contact with the chaos of actual combat. He began, quietly, furiously, obsessively, tearing down everything he had built. Not because he had lost faith in the martial arts, because he was building something no one had ever built before. He was building a way of fighting that had no style, that took from everything and was bound by nothing, that moved like water, filling whatever shape it found, never resisting, never insisting on its own form. He called it Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. But in those early days, in the notebooks he filled in the long hours after his students had gone home, it didn't have a name yet. It was just Bruce Lee alone with his questions and a blank page, and the absolute refusal to stop until he found the truth. That's the first half of this story, and I want you to sit with this for a second, because what we've covered isn't just a fight. It's the moment a legend decided the world wasn't big enough for what he already was, and had to build something bigger. What happened in the months and years after that afternoon in Oakland, the encounters that never made the cameras, the confrontations no studio knew about, the moment one of Hollywood's most dangerous men quietly backed down from a challenge he had loudly made, that story is coming. Stay right here, because the second half of this is where it gets truly unbelievable.
Here is something they never put in the documentaries. In the 18 months following that afternoon in Oakland,
Bruce Lee was challenged 11 more times, not on film sets, not in choreographed demonstrations, in gyms, in parking lots, in the back rooms of martial arts schools where the lights were fluorescent and the floor was bare concrete, and the only witnesses were men who had come to watch someone finally put Bruce Lee in his place. 11 challenges. 11 times Bruce Lee showed up, and not once, not a single time, did the challenger walk away with what they came for. But here's what the legend always gets wrong. Here's what the mythology smooths over in its rush to make Bruce Lee into something superhuman and therefore safely separate from the rest of us. These weren't easy. These weren't one-sided exhibitions. Some of these men were enormous. Some of them were trained to a level that would have destroyed anyone else in that room. The reason Bruce Lee won wasn't that he was unbeatable. The reason Bruce Lee won was that he had done something no one else had done. He had chosen evolution over tradition, and evolution, in a fight, is always the last thing standing. By 1966, Bruce Lee had moved to Los Angeles. The Jun Fan Gung Fu Institute in Oakland was still running. His student, James Lee, no relation, was holding it together. But Bruce had a new orbit now. Hollywood had found him, or more accurately, he had found Hollywood, and the industry that would eventually make him immortal was still, in these early years, deeply uncertain about what to do with him. The television show The Green Hornet had given him Kato, and Kato, the masked driver, the silent bodyguard, the sidekick, was by every metric the network cared about a supporting role. But something strange was happening in the living rooms of America. The letters that arrived at the studio after each episode weren't about Britt Reed, the Green Hornet himself. They were about Kato, about the way Kato moved, about the moments scattered through the episodes like electrical charges when the camera caught Bruce Lee in motion and the audience collectively forgot to breathe. The producers slowed the footage down in post-production. They had to. Bruce Lee moved so fast that the 1960s television cameras, shooting at standard frame rate, were simply missing portions of his movement. The blur between positions wasn't a technical glitch. It was a human being operating at a speed the equipment hadn't been designed to capture. When they slowed it down, what they saw was not the exaggerated theatrical movement of a stunt performer. It was a man who had reduced combat to pure geometry. No wasted motion, no telegraphing, no ceremony, just intention, and then consequence. Word traveled fast in the circles that mattered. The fighters heard, the trainers heard, and in the gyms where serious men worked in serious silence, a name kept surfacing. And with the name, a question. Is it real? In the spring of 1967, a man decided he needed to find out for himself. His name has never been officially confirmed. In the accounts that circulated through the martial arts community, passed from instructor to student to training partner across 3 decades, he is referred to only as the judoka. What is consistent across every version of this story is the outline.
He was a black belt, 7th Dan, a competition fighter with a record that commanded genuine respect in judo circles across the American West Coast. He was 6 feet 2. He weighed just under 220 pounds, and he had, reportedly, issued his challenge not through a letter or through intermediaries, but directly, in person, at a demonstration where Bruce Lee was performing. He walked to the edge of the mat and waited until Bruce had finished, and then in front of the assembled audience, he said the words that fighters across every generation have used as an invitation to disaster. Let's see if it works against a real opponent. Bruce Lee looked at him for a long moment. The room, again, as always in these stories, went quiet. There is something about stillness in these moments that witnesses consistently remark on. Not the stillness of hesitation, not the frozen stillness of shock, the loaded stillness of a system gathering itself, like the second before a thunderclap. Bruce said one word. When? The judoka smiled. He hadn't expected that. The men who smile when they don't expect something are usually men who came looking for theater and found reality instead. They agreed on the following morning. The location was a private gym in Culver City that Bruce had access to through a training connection. He arrived at 6 in the morning. He had slept, Linda would confirm this, for 8 hours. He had eaten breakfast. He was, by every external indicator, approaching the next 90 minutes with the same energy he brought to a regular training session. The judoka arrived with 2 people, training partners or witnesses or both. Accounts differ. Bruce's side had James Coburn, the actor who was by then one of Bruce's most committed private students, and Dan Inosanto, who would go on to become one of the great martial arts teachers of the 20th century. This detail matters, because Coburn and Inosanto were not there to cheer. They were there because they were students. They came to watch their teacher, not to see him perform, but to learn. Whatever happened that morning, they would extract from it every available lesson. This is who Bruce Lee was. Even the fights were classrooms. The judoka was good, better perhaps than his reputation had prepared Bruce for, though anyone who knew Bruce knew that his preparation was never based on reputation alone. He had a judoka's instinct for closing distance, for off-balancing, for turning the momentum of an opponent's movement into a lever. His grips were vice-tight. His timing for throws was exceptional. He got a grip on Bruce's arm in the first 20 seconds. For one heartbeat, one fractional, critical heartbeat, it looked like he might be able to use it. What happened in the next 2 seconds has been described by Dan Inosanto in interviews across multiple decades with a consistency that borders on religious testimony. Bruce Lee did not try to break the grip. He did not pull away, did not resist the direction of force the judoka was establishing, did not attempt to assert strength against strength, which would have been, given the size differential, a losing proposition by pure physics. Instead, he went with it. For one frame of movement, one almost invisible moment of apparent yielding, he gave the judoka exactly what the judoka wanted. And in the precise instant the judoka committed his weight to the throw, Bruce was already somewhere else. Not metaphorically, physically. He had changed position, redistributed weight, shifted the geometry of the exchange so completely and so rapidly that the throw, which had been 90% completed, closed on empty space. The judoka staggered forward. The momentum that had been loaded into the throw was now his alone to deal with. He never fully recovered his footing. Bruce was on him in the moment of that stagger, not with a throw, not with a grappling response, with strikes, 3, rapid, precise, delivered to the midsection and the side of the head in a sequence so fast that Inosanto, by his own account, was not certain how many there had been until he and Coburn compared notes afterward. The judoka went to the floor. He was not unconscious. He was, as Inosanto would describe it later, reorganized, as though his body's understanding of where it was in space had been temporarily suspended and needed a moment to rebuild. He sat on the floor of that gym in Culver City and looked up at Bruce Lee. And Bruce Lee reached down and offered his hand. The judoka took it. That moment, that quiet, uncelebrated reaching down, is the part of the story no one ever tells, because it doesn't fit the mythology. The mythology wants a roar, wants a crowd, wants slow motion and a camera zoom and a swelling score. What it got instead was a 26-year-old man helping his opponent to his feet with the same steady calm he had walked in with. No gloating, no speech, no theater. Just a hand. They trained together for 2 hours after that. The judoka, whatever his private feelings about how the morning had begun, stayed on that mat for 2 hours and absorbed everything Bruce Lee was willing to give, which was, as everyone who trained with Bruce discovered, considerable. He was not possessive with knowledge. He was not a gatekeeper. He was almost frantically generous with what he understood about movement and force and the principles underneath the techniques. Because for Bruce, the point was never to be the best fighter in the room. The point was to understand. To understand so completely that understanding itself became the weapon. He would tell his students, in the converted garage of his Bel Air home where he trained in the deep hours of the morning with a ferocity that alarmed his neighbors, that the goal was not to accumulate techniques. The goal was to shed them, to strip away everything that wasn't necessary until what remained was pure, direct, honest response. No style, no system, no script. Just a human being, fully present, fully awake, moving with the situation rather than against it. He called it being like water. He meant it completely. There's one more confrontation that belongs in this story. It is the least documented, the most contested, the one that serious researchers argue about and serious practitioners whisper about, and the mainstream world has never fully reckoned with. It happened on a film set, late 1971. Bruce Lee was a global phenomenon by then. The Big Boss had detonated across Asia with a force that no one in the industry had predicted, and Fist of Fury was in production. He was no longer the unknown quantity from Oakland. He was the thing itself, the fully formed, publicly recognized, culturally seismic thing. And there was a man on that set, a trained fighter hired as a technical advisor, whose name has been protected across decades either by choice or by embarrassment, who did not believe what he was seeing, who watched Bruce Lee on set and decided that what the camera captured and what was real were two separate things. He said so, out loud, within earshot. The words got back to Bruce. They always did. Now here is where this story becomes something other than a simple fight story, because what Bruce Lee did next was not what any of the men in any of the previous confrontations had expected. He didn't send a message back, didn't call anyone out, didn't issue a formal response. He invited the man to his trailer. One-on-one, no witnesses requested, no arrangement made, just come and let's talk. What happened inside that trailer has been reconstructed from two sources: a crew member who was positioned close enough to hear certain sounds through the walls, and a fragment from a letter Bruce sent to his friend and student Ted Wong several weeks after production wrapped. In the letter, and this is the fragment that has circulated in martial arts circles for 30 years, Bruce wrote the following: "He came in loud, he left quiet. That was enough for both of us." 6 words that have generated more debate, more speculation, and more mythologizing than almost anything else Bruce Lee ever committed to paper, because no one knows exactly what they mean, only that the man who had doubted, loudly, publicly, arrogantly, emerged from that trailer and did not say another word about Bruce Lee for the remainder of production. Not one word, not in anyone's hearing. Whatever he had seen in there, whatever had happened in the space of those minutes inside a film set in Hong Kong in 1971, it had been sufficient.